Dr. Reichman, I want to ask you about quarantines and whether or not they work.
Well, it depends what we're talking about. Quarantine is separating an individual until he shows symptoms or is no longer infectious. And in the pre-drug era for tuberculosis, they used the reason TB rates went down is because people with active TB were sent to the country away from the general society. And then when drugs made people less infectious quickly, the hospitalization was unnecessary. Now, I know you're getting to Ebola and quarantine for Ebola, and I'm not sure that we know what the situation is. And more unfortunately, we're in a the politicians have taken over. The scientists are dismayingly sitting on the sidelines and watching. I'm sure you know that very, very recently the governor of New York and New Jersey said we're going to quarantine everybody who had exposure to an Ebola patient in the 3 at-risk countries in Africa for 21 days. And they were doing that until a very outspoken nurse was hospitalized at my hospital in New Jersey and said, "This is absurd, there's nothing wrong with me." And all the scientists sort of got on the bandwagon and said there's no reason to hospitalize this person. Plus the fact it's going to scare all the people who are going to go and do good in the 3 at-risk countries in Africa.
These would be medical health workers.
Yeah, medical health workers. And so the governor and both governors, Cuomo and Christie, backed down. And I hope they're very embarrassed because it was really a black mark, but it shows how politicians try and make hay out of a scientific situation and sometimes get burned, which they deserve.
If they get burned, can we expect to see more embargoes or more political positions?
Well, that's a very good question because it depends what the situation is. For instance, Tom Frieden, who is the director of the Centers for Disease Control, is a very respected scientist and took care of TB in New York and a large part in India. And he became the spokesman on Ebola and was giving scientifically correct answers to questions, but they weren't politically correct because it's like the question, can you catch Ebola on the subway? Because one of these patients was riding the subway and everyone was hysterical. Now, presumably, if he was bleeding and someone, inhaled, the blood went into a cut, yes. But that's so absurdly unlikely. But people don't understand the likelihood. So when I'm asked that kind of question, and it's always with TB, because that's my specialty, can you catch TB in the subway? The answer is not no. The answer is, soundbite, yes, but it's more likely the subway will crash. So there, the person who's listening, who's not a sophisticated person, how many subway crashes have we had in recent years? I can't think of any. So how many TB transmissions have we had in the subway? I can't think of any. So these are the kind of things. I think we need to educate, and this is an impossible task, educate the outer community on risk assessment. This is what this is called. And I think it's an impossible case.
You wrote a book called Time Bomb, which described the circumstances in New York when there was a tuberculosis outbreak in the 1990s. Applicable lesson, and that book is still available, and I've read it and recommend it.
Unfortunately, it's out of print, but you can get it on Amazon for $4 or something.
And well worth every penny. Lessons from that you can draw from the book, or we can draw from your book, in terms of how tuberculosis was handled 20, 30 years ago?
Well, we recognized 20, 30 years ago that tuberculosis was a problem, but we recognized that it was an infrastructure problem. So they had to fix the infrastructure, which had been allowed to deteriorate. Plus, they had to do new imaginative things, like they found that there was a lot of TB transmission in Rikers Island, the jail in New York City. So they had to have special receiving cells that had non-recirculated air and sterilized air for the people who came in who had TB symptoms. And this whole situation cost $1 billion. $1 billion to turn around an epidemic where if they'd kept the infrastructure going, they wouldn't have had to spend that much money. And I think the lesson for all of us with TB, with Ebola, is we must have an infrastructure that does surveillance, that does preventive activities, so that when something happens, Ebola or SARS or H1N1, that we can deal with it without getting hysterical and reinventing the wheel.
Any thoughts on what the next evolution of either political or scientific response to Ebola is going to be?
I think hopefully there won't be any more transmission in the United States or developed countries. Hopefully the worst case scenario is if a patient gets Ebola who wasn't in one of these countries. So far we've only had the Ebola cases have been people who have been in those countries. And if that goes on for a couple of cycles of transmission, 21 days each, it'll gradually stop being a front page item, and we can go back to football.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.